Thank you and good evening. And I'm impressed that folks would come here on this evening, although it is pretty smoky and very hot in Boise, so maybe it's an easy choice. I see some faces that I'm familiar with and I see some that I'm not, so I'm hoping to get a better idea of what you guys are interested in hearing about, and maybe I can gear my discussion a little bit more towards what you'd like to hear, some things that Eric and I can address. So I'm going to talk pretty briefly, and then I think Eric will talk pretty briefly, and we can do a Q&A session and kind of open it up and see what's on folks' mind. I'm going to show a quick video, talk a little bit about affordable housing and housing in general, talk a little bit about what that looks like, who needs it, and then finally go into kind of high level, some of the challenges and perhaps some of the solutions. And then Eric will get into his presentation. So first, if you guys will bear with me, I'd love to show you this very brief YouTube video. Let's see if the technology works for us.
Ever wonder why rent is so high, or why home?
I think it gives a very, it's cute. It's kind of fun to watch, and it's, like I said, brief, but I think it provides a nice way to start the conversation. So if you will, here, let's see.
Ever wonder why rent is so high, or why home prices seem to keep rising out of reach? Why is that? One reason is we don't have enough places to live. Remember musical chairs? When we were kids, you had to be fast. But in the housing market, instead of being fast, you just need to be rich. Here's how it works. Imagine there are 2 houses and 3 families playing. The music stops, and everybody scrambles for a home. The wealthy family gets the big house. The middle-class family gets one too. But there's no house left for the last family. What if the neighborhood added a new house? Let's make it a fancy one. The wealthy family says, "Hey, cool," and moves in. The middle-class family decides to spread out, and the family with the least money finds a home in their neighborhood. Nobody is out of the game, or out of a home.
Oh, yeah.
What if we played the same game citywide? You see, our city is really a huge game of musical chairs, and we're all playing. When there aren't enough homes for the people who live and work here, everybody has to compete for what's available, and the rents go up and up until people are priced out of the city and have to drive farther and farther to get to work. To fix it, we need more homes. Let's see what happens if we add more cottages and condos. Let's swap these old warehouses for something more comfortable. How about a mother-in-law apartment? What if our communities add enough homes of all shapes and sizes for all our neighbors? Ah, that's better. More homes means more of us can stay and thrive in the city we love. And that's great. Want to do more? Visit sightline.org/morehomes.
Nice blowing.
How many of you all have seen that before? Anyone? A couple in the audience have, okay. So quick introduction of who I am. I'm Shellan Rodriguez. I work for CCDC, which is the Urban Renewal Agency in Boise now. My background is quite different than what I'm doing now, and I think that's probably part of the reason that I was invited to come here this evening. But for the first 10 to 15 years of my career, I did a lot of multifamily housing development in the government sector with the Public Housing Authority, as well as in the nonprofit sector. And then the last leg of that multifamily development career was in private for-profit development sector. So I bring a very different perspective than many folks having had that background. I worked in various states around the western United States, including primarily California, Montana, a little bit in Idaho, Nevada, and Arizona. So I can speak kind of big picture regionally to what some other communities or states are able to do, and I can also speak a little bit about what Boise is or isn't able to do. But for statewide communications, it's kind of the statewide issues, I'm probably going to defer to Eric quite a bit because I'm not as familiar. So currently I'm with CCDC. We do a lot of work in downtown Boise. We're an urban renewal agency. We're run by the state of Idaho. I'm the real estate development manager there. I have certainly played a role in creating some housing units in downtown. I've also created a role in developing many other types of development. So I have a sense of what it takes to create housing, affordable housing, multifamily housing, as well as commercial and hotels and all these other sorts of stuff. I'm also a commissioner on the Boise City Ada County Public Housing Authorities Board, which is essentially the primarily HUD-funded agency that's tasked with housing the most, I would say, desperate, some of the most desperate members of the community. So with that, that's me. Affordable housing is what I'll kind of open up with, and just so I get a sense of who you guys are and what you're thinking. Do you think about affordable housing on occasion? Is it something that you care deeply about? Is it something that you're experiencing? What do you think? Care deeply about? You're experiencing issues with? What do you think of when you think of affordable housing?
I work with that every day, so it's live and breathe.
You're living and breathing it. When I say affordable housing, what do you think of? Do you think of
housing?
What's that?
Unaffordable housing.
Unaffordable
Yeah.
housing, you think the opposite? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think of multifamily units? Do you think of single-family homes? First-time home buyer?
I think housing that's attainable for people that are making the current living wages in this economy, the local economy.
Housing that's obtainable for people making the current living wage. That's good. Anything else come to mind? Hearing none. For me personally, I oftentimes think of where I was when I had the opportunity to buy my first home. Right? That's for some reason where I go. But it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And in my discussions with communities and public officials, neighborhood associations, it's very difficult sometimes to get to a definition of what affordable housing means. It's clearly a hot topic, right? In the front page of the paper today, we learned that I think Nampa and Boise were the top 5 places to flip homes. Most people in the housing industry will say when you are flipping homes, you are hitting a point where the cycle will change. When there's a mass idea, or there's people without experience becoming becoming developers, and when houses are being flipped, it's kind of a thing, right? So we saw that in the newspaper today. I did a quick Google search yesterday, I believe, Idaho Statesman, affordable housing. Every few weeks, you've gotten some type of article on affordable housing and up against growing Boise, Treasure Valley. You can't get anything for $200,000. The median home price is now right around the $300,000 range. Good luck finding a home kind of articles, right? So it's clearly a hot issue right now. The images that you see on the right of your screen are, I spent literally 5 minutes thinking about who plays a role in housing and affordable housing in the Treasure Valley. And, high level, you have HUD, right? Housing and Urban Development, Secretary Dr. Ben Carson. He is in charge of the federal housing programs. We have state, Idaho Housing Financing Agency right around the corner here. We from the state level, who does a lot of lending as well as the tax credit allocations. We have the city, Housing and Community Development. They do first-time homebuyer programs, home improvement, sustainability issues, as well as rental housing. We have NeighborWorks Boise, who has an umbrella national organization, but plays a major role in the home ownership and affordable home ownership piece here in the Treasure Valley, as well as smaller nonprofits that are more locally focused, like Catch, which is focused primarily on housing homeless people, and even more nuanced is housing homeless families. We have NewPath, then we have the developers and the developments. So we have these agencies, federal, state, local, nonprofits, and then we have the developers. So NewPath Housing was one that came to mind because I think almost all of the organizations that you see here played some type of role in the creation of 40 units close to downtown, known as the NewPath Housing development. It's a housing first model. It's the first one of its kind in the state, pretty unique to Idaho, but certainly an interesting project that has occurred. So what is affordable housing? Going back, the federal definition we kind of default to in the industry, it comes from HUD. In general, housing for which the occupants pay no more than 30% of their income for gross housing costs, including utilities. And then they have the caveat that it's a rule of thumb, and jurisdictions handle it slightly different based on the numbers in those jurisdictions. Then there's what we call the HUT index. I think Erik can talk a little bit more to that, but it's the housing utilities transportation. So if you are paying 30% of your income to housing, you should not be paying more than 45% of your income to your housing utilities and transportation costs. HUT is probably a better, more encompassing way of looking at it, right? If you have high housing costs but low transportation costs, your housing costs could be 45%. If you're paying more than that, you're cost burdened. You are at risk of not being able to afford other things, right? Food, medical, recreation, whatever it is. But that is a definition. There are many, but that is the one that I wanted to focus on. So just really quick, income categories. There's workforce, families, low income, very low income, extremely low income. You can see on this chart, it's based on a percent of area median income for Ada County. 81 to 120% qualifies as workforce, and for a family of 4 in Ada County, that's about $84,000 a year. That could be a single parent with 3 children. That could be 2 parents and 2 kids. It can look many different ways. 1 income earner, 2 income earners, perhaps situations where there could be more. So that is who we're talking about when we talk about affordable housing from an industry perspective. Not necessarily when we are neighbors thinking about how can we afford to move into, we have a new baby on the way, or our family dynamics are changing and we want to move location, or we want to get into a different school district. That is not necessarily addressed in HUD's definition of affordable housing. So locally, there's roughly 88,000 households in Boise, of which 65% are at the workforce housing AMI, area median income, or higher. So 65% of the households in Boise are making more than 80% of the area median income, which means 35% are not. And that means that 35%, you see that 9% are low income. This is kind of this slide didn't come out quite right. 65% I said are workforce middle, 16% are low, 10% are very low, and 9% are extremely low. Extremely low, didn't really talk about on the last slide. It's 0 to 30%. These are folks who likely are not working, they're likely disabled, or are just living off of Social Security. Very hard to house, and are typically either being housed with family or using some kind of subsidy. So who is this in our community, right? Like who needs this affordable housing? So I show you just looking at Bureau of Labor statistics for the state and some Indeed.com job descriptions, right? Elementary school teacher in Boise roughly makes $4,000 a month. He or she should be able to afford approximately $1,200 in monthly rent. EMT paramedic, $3,200 a month, roughly $1,000, $960 in rent. Try to take a look at those numbers. We can go back and forth. But then you have a child care worker. I have a 6 and a 4-year-old at home, and I rely heavily on my child care workers. And it is so interesting to think that a man or woman who is taking care of my children is making $1,500 a month and could theoretically afford $460 if he or she was perhaps a single parent. Now, every family is different, but there's situations there might be 2 child care workers, or a child care worker and a mother or father who's doing something different. But a single mom with a kid, they can afford, working as a child care worker full-time, $460 a month. So these 2 graphs, or this chart and this graph, are really just intended. I got them on the internet. I can't really vouch for exactly how accurate they are. But you can see the black graph combines multifamily and single family. And I don't know if you can see my mouse here on the screen, but if you look at the past year, March 17 through March 18, you'll see that the average rent has increased from roughly $1,187 up to $1,300. So that's nearly 10% in rent increases. At the same time, and that includes single family and multifamily. Put that in perspective in home ownership, I think home ownership or sales prices have increased over 20% in the last year. Average multifamily Boise rents for a one-bedroom is $900. You get your workforce that's able to afford it. Your teachers are able to afford it, hopefully. Now, your special ed teachers and your administrator, your lower level administrators or technicians are not able to afford it. Interestingly, on this one, I always joke about it, legislators, clergy members, or workforce housing. I never use them in the chart because they don't work all year. Perhaps, I guess it depends who you ask. But it just goes to show you that if an average rent of a one-bedroom unit is $900 right now in Boise, not many people who serve us our coffees, serve us our food, work at Winco are able to live here. Does anyone have any questions?
What happened in December?
Oh, December 15? It's a good question. I would have thought that all Decembers would have dipped down a little bit more than they do just because it's a tough time to be moving. You know, it's just not when you're moving. But yeah, December 15, it looks like something happened, so I can't speak to that.
Oh, you got one over here.
So using average rent, which is either the geometric average or the median, depending on what your source is, and comparing that to what somebody with below average income is able to afford is a little bit odd, because you would think that the median income is affording the median rent, but that means there are rents available that are less than the average that people that make less than the average can afford.
Say it again, so I understand.
You wouldn't expect somebody in the 25th percentile of income to buy a home at the 50th, or rent a home at the 50th percentile of rental prices.
So if and when that's happening, somebody is cost burdened. Is that what you're?
Well, no, I'm just saying that there's, even if the average rent is $899 for a one bedroom, means roughly half of the rental units available are less than that.
Correct.
So that you wouldn't necessarily expect people that make less than median income to have to pay $899 to have a place to stay, because half of the places cost less than that.
And you're assuming that all median income folks are going to be renters. And I think the industry.
Yeah, the buying versus.
Buying versus renting. So I think that gets into a pretty big philosophical conversation, right? But I think there is an idea in the United States that at some point people can choose to buy. And is that point at 100%, 120%, 200%, right? Is that kind of where you're?
Oh, just saying that.
Does that help?
Among the rent, I don't want to get too far into it, but among renters, there are homes that are not at the middle. There are rentals that are cost less than the median.
Absolutely.
Basically. A large fraction of them do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As a follow-up to that, do you know what the lower end of the rent is? 2 years ago, when I was looking for one person, the lowest I could find was $700 for something that was livable, where the floor wasn't rotting out, where I couldn't believe it hadn't been condemned. So, and I'm guessing that lower number is higher now?
I've got a handout that has some information on the rental vacancy rates in the kind of quote-unquote affordable cohort. I'll hand those out kind of during the break, or if there's a break.
No, that'd be great. And somebody give me a sign if I'm talking too long. But another way to think about that is what HUD allows the housing authority, say, to pay for rent. So if a family is qualified, they get a Section 8 voucher, and they are allowed to go find a unit to rent. And they'll pay 30% of their income towards their rent, and the remaining part will come from a Section 8 voucher. Makes great sense. There have been times where if you have a Section 8 voucher, that's your golden ticket to a unit, right? You have the ability to pay 30% of your income so that the rest of your income can go to utilities, transportation, medical bills, childcare, whatever. And so you're in the realm of affordability, and the government will help subsidize the remaining portion of that rent. So, but the government says, well, we're not going to pay you anything, Mr. Landlord or Mrs. Landlord. We're going to pay you the fair market value, which currently in the city and the county, a 3-bedroom fair market value is $1,251. So you find these folks who have been on a waiting list for a Section 8 voucher for however many years, and they cannot find a place to rent because the fair market value that HUD allows is lower than the actual market value. So I think that just goes to illustrate your point in that there are certainly units that are much lower rent. Are they nice units? Are they in areas that people want to live? You know, hard to say all the time, but HUD has said this is the fair market rent, and when your market rate has exploded over that, you have an affordability problem. Because they should be aligned. In theory, I should say. It's not an opinion, it's more like theoretically it should be aligned.
How often do they realign them?
How often do the rents get?
Does HUD realign?
Annually.
Yeah.
Yeah, annually. Okay. So challenges to creating affordable housing. I mean, I feel like I see lots of neighborhood folks in here. I see housing developers. I see project managers. I see elected officials. I see caseworkers, perhaps.
Indy 12.
Indy Dwell. Cool. Cool. So challenges to creating it and some ideas to consider. I will try to speak to some. There's a lack of federal, state, and local money. That should be no surprise. The asterisk that I have there is that this budget year, HUD has actually has increased their funded for housing authorities across the country for the first time in many, many years. Now, the industry does not believe that that increase is going to maintain, but it's still, it's pretty interesting that in today's times that has been increased. State housing trust funds, we have a state housing trust fund in Idaho. It has never been funded. Soft monies, which are kind of first in, last out monies, usually they're competitive, but they're sort of more flexible financing options for developers are really hard to come by in Idaho. There's some housing incentives at the city, right, per unit for new development, but there's just not a lot of public money. And the costs are the costs. Oh, do you have a question?
Just time.
Oh, time, thanks. Costs are the costs. So this is a national image or a national graph, and it's really just aimed to show you that the National Home Builder Association has basically categorized the cost of building a home. So of that, roughly 30% is labor, 20% of materials. Add another 10% to that becomes the kind of the materials or the finish. 11% is other. I'm not clear totally what that means. 9% is profit. People get really down on that one. 18% is land and 4% is regulatory. So which of those things can we control? Public agencies can perhaps control regulatory. Land, you increase density, you increase supply, right? The land per unit becomes less. It's like we talked about with musical chairs. Profit, if people don't make a profit, they're not going to continue doing it. And labor is labor. It really can't control that much besides, I would say, like high level, promoting higher education for folks to become electricians and plumbers and stuff like that. But that's kind of a multi-generational thing. So remember the musical chairs in the video. In the next 20 years, Boise is projected to have 50,000 new residents, needing 20,000 new residential units, roughly 1,000 units a year. Sounds like a lot, but based on the last couple years, the community has been creating roughly 1,000, 1,100 units. But for who? Right? They don't the community is not necessarily creating 1,000 units for every band of income, right? Because if costs are high and land is high and labor is high, how can you? So what as communities can we do? We have carrots and we have sticks, right? I mean, it's easy. I will say I worked many years in California, and there's lots of sticks. It's codified, it's regulatory. You will create housing in every development you do. It will look like this, and it will not happen in Idaho. We are non-regular. We don't love regulation here, and inclusionary zoning is not something that is in the purview of the Idaho Constitution, right? I mean, it's been ruled unconstitutional. That's fine, because I have toddlers, right? I guess they're not quite toddlers anymore, but they perform better with carrots than with sticks. And I believe that the communities and developers do too. So inclusionary zoning, I'm just going to cross it out. But density and land use planning is really important, and it's something that I think the community can help control. You increase densities, you create communities that have perhaps less transportation cost, lower land cost per unit, i.e. more affordability. You can promote, when you create density in places of dense housing, you can promote other types of land uses. So you can promote a dense housing development with open space or park. Diversity of housing types. I think Erik might touch on this a little bit, but cooperatives, micro units, land trusts, mission-related investments like social impact investing, where folks are able to speak to their mission and perhaps take a slightly lower return or the low side of the market return in order to meet their mission. Senior housing, specifically geared towards folks over the age of 55 or 65. Housing for homeless folks, I talked about families or individuals, right? Just specific types of housing. A diversity of housing types will help create housing for those different bands of the community. Student housing as well. People often look at me and say, what are you talking about? Well, when students have places to live that are geared for students, then they're no longer living in maybe those other units that could be affordable to the community that are not students. So it creates churn in those, it creates more chairs, right? It creates a little bit more musical chairs. So reducing building costs, how do you do that? That's the futurist, right? You get the robots, you get the shipping containers, you use the modular building, right? That's happening. But it can create affordability. Reducing the timeline, right? Time is money, entitlements and permitting cost time. When we do that, we can create affordability when we enable that. And just increasing certainty. That's increasing certainty for elected officials. It's increasing certainty for neighborhoods. When you buy your property, know what your zoning is and know what your neighbor's zoning is. If you don't, and if you're not comfortable with what that zoning is, you may not be able to change it. Make the choice knowingly, right? I mean, it's not that all places are zoned correctly, but just know what you're doing. Create certainty, neighborhood associations, long-term planning, all that stuff. YIMBY sounds like you're going to have a whole session on it, which I think is great. Yes, in my backyard, you need to if you're going to create more supply of housing, you have to have people that are saying, yes, it can be near me. It's a hard one. It's a really tough one. And Gary's not here today, but he's been emailing me for the past month telling me to talk about this, and it's really his baby. But create partnerships to align resources. And the city of Boise did that with NewPath Housing. And they said, look, St. Al's, look, St. Luke's. When people are homeless, they come to the emergency room and they cost you money. They cost you $53,000 a year, a homeless person. Cost the community, and including St. Luke's and the hospital, $53,000 a year. So therefore, you should create this housing first model, and you should put your resources there so that those folks won't be using your resources inefficiently. So create these partnerships, economic developers, workforce housing. I could see it in large employers too, right? Large employers, they want to do a call center or whatever it is, and it's like, look, their housing's not affordable here. I'm going to create housing for my employees. So those partnerships are interesting. That, I think, is all I have. I hope I didn't go way too long. Do we want to do questions now, or want to turn it over to Eric?
What's got a question? Go.
Hi, so I'm from public health, and I was just curious if you've looked at the Alice report for any affordability data. United Way does that. They had a recent 2018 report that might be useful.
Yeah, it's a great report. I don't know if I get to do all of this. I love housing, and I have to do a lot of things in my current role, but it is a really great report, and it really talks about, at least, I don't know that I've seen the 18. Does it come out in April?
Yeah.
I don't know how familiar I am with 18, but 2017 really does talk about what it looks like to be on the brink of a place where you may not have safe and stable housing. And it doesn't always look like what you'd think. And that was kind of my point with the workforce housing teacher making $4,000 a year, able to afford $1,200 a month. But if she's got 3 kids, it's really hard to find a unit for $1,200 a month. So that speaks to that report, but it's a really good one. The United Way does a great job on it.
It's not a question, but you need to add another category. You've got student housing, and that's a great point. But having had someone who just graduated from college, a lot of student housing isn't affordable today for students, and that's one of the reasons they're moving off campus. So we need our universities to realize the need to provide affordable housing for their students.
Yeah, it's a good point. And a lot of the federal programs and state programs don't enable students to participate. So it is this kind of a weird issue, right? Where you have perhaps part-time community members who need affordable housing, don't qualify for the subsidies, are important parts of the economy, right? And can't find a place to live. That's a very good point. So Eric, I think I set you up.
Okay.
And I'll just.
It was so nice that you said, oh yeah, Eric's going to have a few brief comments. You don't know me very well. I'm just kidding. Not really. Okay, so first of all, this is a kind of an odd housing unit, okay, but that was my first, the first place I lived in when I moved to Boise to Idaho in 1979. That's up in the Yankee Fork, kind of upriver or upstream from the Loon Creek Guard Station. But I shared that house with 3 other guys, and it was crazy. So anyway, but housing is pretty diverse. Let's see. So just a little bit about my perspective. So I've been at Idaho Housing and Finance Association since 1995. I started as senior communications coordinator back then. And in 1998, I started something called the Housing Information Referral Center, which was kind of a recommendation from Phil Batts, Governor's Affordable Housing Advisory Task Force. And that red rotary dial phone you see, I had to hunt all over Boise to find that thing. I called it the Bat phone because it was, Phil Batt was the guy that. So anyway, it's a little backstory, trivia for HIRC. So I work a lot on fair housing issues, accessibility issues, ADA stuff, even though it's not necessarily housing related, but it's tangential. Ramp Up Idaho is a program that I helped get started with some other folks involved with the Idaho Community Review Team through Idaho Rural Partnerships. So I work on housing information, education outreach, but I also do a lot of work with what I call non-traditional, like non-housing partners. So working with people on economic development, community development, on the bike and ped, advisory committee with Deanna, the Central Edition, kind of group. So trying to connect dots, look at how does your field, relate to housing? How does housing relate to you guys? I teach a course at the Northwest Community Development Institute called Housing as a Second Language, because it's kind of like that for some people. And so it's really a very diverse position. It's a department of one, which suits my personality pretty well. And lets me meet a lot of really interesting people. So I'm really glad to see so many people turning out for this. How many of you guys show up for planning and zoning meetings or city council meetings? good. Yeah, well, I know you do. That's good. Well, keep doing it. It's worth it because, decisions are made by people who show up at meetings, right? Okay, so just to start off, this is sort of my philosophy. I see housing markets as like an ecosystem where you have a lot of diverse niches to fill, and as was pointed out earlier, we need housing for everybody in the community. And I try to stay away from the term affordable housing because I find it's a trigger for some people that I talk with in Idaho. So I just say you need housing types and price points that meet the needs of all people in your community. Whether they're retired, whether they're a mechanic or a doctor or a barista, whatever. Everybody needs a place to live, and when everybody has stable housing, they can be their best self. They can be good parents or better parents. They can be better employees, et cetera, et cetera. And the quote that I really like to reinforce is that when there's housing that's affordable to all income levels, it represents a perpetual wage subsidy for your local employers. And there's a connection there. So just something to think about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about disruptors. And I've been really focused on this the last 18 months or 24 months, I guess, and talking quite a bit about it. Now, some of this you can just dismiss and you can say, oh, that guy's crazy. What does he know? And other stuff, maybe you'll see the point there. But I'm going to talk about three things: commodification, or treating housing as a commodity; conversions, meaning conversions from long-term rental to something else; and poverty. So poverty is linked pretty closely with the disruptive thing, the sort of wage disparities, income disparities, things like that. So what do I mean by these? So commodification, I'm not going to read all this to you, just so you don't have to worry about me doing that. Because I know all of you guys can read. Anybody that can't read, let me know, and you give me kind of a sign and I'll read them. Otherwise, I won't. So it's the difference between looking at housing as, that's where I want to raise my kids, I like this neighborhood, I want to be part of this community, or looking at housing as no different from pork belly futures, investing in pork belly futures or some other commodity, right? That's what I'm talking about. So when I talk about legacy residential conversions, anybody remember the Glenwood Apartments in Boise? I see somebody nodding. When you have a property that's a rental property, and the family that owns it or the individual that owns it has had it for for a couple of decades, chances are they have little or no carrying costs, right? They don't have any financing costs to worry about. So they can keep those rents pretty low. As soon as they turn that over and it sells to a new owner, they've got a bank loan. So, they need to cover their mortgage and they're going to raise the rent. And so that's what happened with Glenwood. It's what happened with multiple properties. And it happened at a time when we're starting to see a real shortage of rental housing in Boise. So it just really threw people out, out into the cold, literally. And that when I was getting a lot of calls on the housing hotline. So that's the other part of my job. Other duties as assigned. I run this statewide housing hotline, and I figure I probably talked to 35,000 people since 1998 that call that same phone. And most of them are from here, Ada County and Treasure Valley, but some of them they're all from all over the state, basically. And most of them are single moms. I'd say a slight majority who are struggling with childcare, with kind of keeping things together and facing housing instability. So that makes things pretty interesting. It takes it out of the academic realm, and when you're dealing with real people like that every day. Increasing poverty and debt. You guys know what this is all about. And people that don't have good credit obviously have fewer choices when it comes to where they can live. And that choice issue, housing choice. Let's see, what did I do with my beverage? Anybody see a stray coffee cup?
On the other side.
Oh, great, thank you. Thanks. It takes a village. Oh well, I'll move on. So, home or commodity? I kind of brushed on this, so you get the idea. One of the big things that's happened in the last few years is the topic of a UN report on global investment in housing. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is probably the largest single influx of money globally into the residential market. $163 trillion, to put it mildly, or to put it more clearly. That has a big impact. So think people who are hedging, against inflation in their own country, who are laundering money, who are trying to hide money from somebody, or people that just see, a deal in the U.S. or Canada, and they're moving money. Most of it's coming from China. The large percentage of that is coming from China. It's dropped in the last, over the last year or so. The amount of money from China that's coming into the U.S. has dropped by about 21%, so it's down to about $30 billion a year right now. And 3 or 4 other countries combined are about $29 billion in investment in the U.S. markets. What that does is it ties up housing stock, and it drives prices up because they're coming in and saying, we don't care how much it costs, we'll buy 10 units in that high-rise apartment in Vancouver, and we'll just store cash and antiques there. And so you go through cities that have these ghost neighborhoods, they're called, where you look at these high-rise buildings, and at night maybe 10% of the lights are on because all the rest of them are storage units and they don't need lighting. So it has an impact. It displaces people who would normally live and work in those city centers or in the community. They're forced to move farther and farther away. That has an impact on everybody. And at some point, they start getting displaced and they move into secondary markets, as do the people who are normally dealing in real estate in those primary markets. They start getting priced out and they say, oh, I'm going to go to Boise, I'm going to go to Spokane, or I'm going to go somewhere else. And so that ripple effect is really interesting. And the sort of irony, quote of the decade, I think, was Xi Jinping. And I don't know, can anybody read that? I forget, it was like, 房子是为了, it's some weird Chinese thing, but what it translates to is housing is for living in, not for speculating. And so I thought it was really interesting. That was his comment to the Communist Party convention last fall. So they're seeing it in China, and he's trying to keep, the Chinese people from continuing to have this inflationary kind of spiral in their own country. So anyway, it's a global thing, and it has all kinds of ripple effects, and you can kind of see those up on that screen while I'm taking a drink. So it has impacts, and what it means is there are subsidies to this inflation that are indirect. It costs communities, it costs employers, it costs people when their residential infrastructure gets out of control. Flipping, talked about flipping earlier. So this is a big one. So Matthew Gardner is, I saw him speak last year here in Boise. He's with Windermere Realty. He's their economist out of Seattle. And he will be here in Boise October 8th. So if you know anybody with Windermere Realty, hit him up and see if you can be their +1 to this talk, because it's worth hearing his perspective. So he talked about the rise in all these flipping shows on TV, on cable TV. There was the Boise Boys that got a lot of, they were pushing that one real hard on social media ads recently. The one at the bottom, Flip Lifestyle, it says we'll be back soon. That's because they went out of business. Their website's out of commission. So they're starting to lose money in primary markets. They're still, working in secondary markets. But he said they are like the canary in the coal mine. They're sort of an indicator of a bubble, right? And I think you kind of alluded to that earlier. So the other thing that I thought was interesting is it's the National Bureau of Economic Research or something like that, that basically looked at the underlying causes of the recession. And we call it the subprime meltdown, right? And the implication there is that it was subprime borrowers that caused the crash. What they looked at is people who were basically underwater on their mortgages, and most of them were juggling more than 2 mortgages. Okay, so that indicates folks that were spec investment types. They were flipping, they were trying to acquire more property. So that has an impact. The other thing that Matthew Gardner says is this, and I know how many realtors we got in the audience. I know one, my favorite. So I would say my message to realtors is like this. If let's say you're a fisherman or a fisher person, right? And you've got fisheries that you use to make your living, and it's in your long-term interest to make sure that those fish are healthy and that their habitat's healthy, because that means guaranteed income for you. Likewise, if you're in the real estate business and you depend on a steady stream of clients over time, you want to make sure, A, that those prospective clients have decent credit, that they're not financially burdened all the time, and that they're not seeing their credit go down every year, because there's is a market where there's some movement. When the market's locked up, you don't have any middle price housing, people aren't moving around. I mean, I could probably sell my house right now for a ton of money, but I can't move anywhere. And I don't want to leave my neighborhood. I'm there for the long haul, right? So when the market's locked up, things get tight. And back in the lead up to the bubble and the kind of crash, there were places in Colorado and other kind of hot markets where the agents outnumbered the listings. That was a thing. So we want to watch that. This is one of the other indicators, or one of the other sort of housing as commodity kind of issues. And I don't want to kind of make anybody bad, and like say they're bad people or anything like that. But when you look at these houses, these are places that in the East End Historic District. It's for sale. Yeah, no, yeah, you can get that. I don't know if it's sold already.
No.
Anybody know? Still for sale?
Yeah, 2.6.
Yeah, there you go. It's a steal, really. But the point I want to make with these is not to say, look at these horrible people that build these giant houses. It is in a historic district, when you have an expectation of a certain mass and scale of housing and a certain architectural style and a certain vintage, when you see something that's out of line or incongruous, appraisers, any appraisers in the audience? So I got this from an appraiser that I know, and he says, when you see incongruity in a market, that has a negative effect on the adjacent properties. So imagine to yourself, if you're trying to sell a house next to the castle, or next to one of these giant houses that basically shades the houses on either side of it, and it's like, oh, what are you doing in your backyard today? I mean, there's no privacy. If you're a gardener, if you've got a landscaping that you built up over decades, it's gone, because all of a sudden your solar patterns are different. So having a house that's so out of scale with the rest of the neighborhood is a statement, and it can keep people from wanting to buy the houses adjacent to it. But it has a different effect in that, because of its value or its assessed price, it can raise the assessed values of the entire neighborhood, right? So everybody else that's long-term residents like me, we just see our property taxes go up. That doesn't help me at all, but it does mean that I have to pay more out of pocket every year. Okay, so here's a sample of exactly that. Looking at this, the bottom of this is year 2000. So this is a house that I know very well. I won't tell you whose house it is, but I know it really well. So you can see, there's some bumps, and you can see it's pretty common sense when you think about the bubble that we went through, that there was a period of time, in like 2006, 7, 8, where Idaho was a little slow to the crash, basically, and the bubble, but we got there. And I happen to know that let's see if I can get my cursor in here. At around 2008, this house, 2007, 2008, this house had a basement put under it, right? Double the square footage, right? So you'd say, oh, well, that makes sense. But it wasn't really appraised or assessed with that extra for square footage until late 2008, 2009. And all of a sudden, the market started to go down. And right around here, 2015, 2016, we see it really ramping up again. Now, it's like you might say, okay, that's consistent with what I'm seeing, what I saw in other markets. But then I said, well, what was going on in my neighborhood at the same time that those prices started to really go up? And then I remembered, oh yeah, 3 homes within a block were flipped at that point. Several other homes were scraped and had these giant homes put on the lots, built out almost to the lot lines. So correlation is not causation, but it's an indicator. So what that means is if you, yep.
Are you including flipped homes as investment homes? Because we also had investment homes happen in that area around that time.
I'm not. I'm isolating it to these homes that I know were flipped. So flipping, for those of you who don't know that term, it's buying a home with the intention of selling it again within 12 months and not living in it as your primary residence, okay? So the intent is to, kind of just get in, make some changes to it, sell it for more money and get out. So in these cases, these homes, were purchased and then resold for, a 50 to 100% markup, within 12 months. So that has an effect. They become comparables for other homes in the same area, and prices start to go up. So now, if you look at, the average home in that area, you're going to see $42,000 in additional property tax, okay, over what you might have seen if there was just organic valuation, increasing over that 20 years. So it means an extra $175 a month for the person who's paying just property tax, not insurance, right? Not principal and interest. So debt, we're seeing debt go way up. Those are the other kind of bubbles to look for, student loan debt, auto loan debt. I always say, if you look at what people are going to pay first, they're going to make their truck payment first, right? Because they don't want to get their truck repoed. Credit card debt, I talk to a lot of people that have massive debt, and that's a real barrier for them. Talked a little bit about this, referenced Glenbrook, and talked about that concept, so we can kind of move on there. Short-term rentals, you all are familiar with this. You've probably seen articles about the debate around short-term rentals. A lot of local governments have tried to put sideboards up and say, okay, how can we create the kind of conditions we want so that we can retain housing for people who live and work here. The state legislature has made that more difficult, through some preemptive legislation. I did a community review in Cascade back in 2016, March, and Valley County at the time, when we did the review, 72% of the housing market was either a vacation home or a short-term rental. By the time I went back for an economic summit 9 months later, that number was up to 78%. So what that means, if you can imagine, go outside and look around Boise, if only 2 out of 10 homes were available for people who work here or who live here full time, that would be a significant impact, especially if you're an employer, right? So it has huge impacts on communities and the local economy. And it's one thing if it's, a mom and pop, somebody that's retired and they're trying to supplement their income by renting out a couple rooms or their garage or something like that. But when there's so much profit to be made, it starts attracting institutional investors. And that's when you get companies that come in, real estate investment trusts that buy 10 or 20 or 30 homes in one market and use them as Airbnbs because they make a lot of money on them. And I've stayed in Airbnbs, full disclosure. I'm not totally against them, but I think there should be some frank discussion about the kind of cost benefit of those in terms of policy. Switzerland in 2012 amended their constitution to say that no more than 20% of the housing stock in any city or canton could be a short-term rental or a cold bed, as they refer to it.
A what?
Cold bed. So meaning something that's only inhabited part of the time. Where your neighbors are not your neighbors, really. They're just passing through. Let's see. I got to check my time here. Got to hurry. Okay, ripple effects. You can see up there kind of the relationship. Rents are going up really fast. We're losing rental units. We've got a net loss of rental units. At the same time, we're seeing more people that need the rental units. So again, supply and demand is a real big driver. So how do we fix it? I don't know. You guys got any ideas? Well, first of all, I'm just kidding. If you can somehow slow down the hemorrhage, that loss of affordability, by figuring out ways to keep those legacy properties, those legacy rental properties in place and in use by people who need them. Otherwise, every time they're converted, the costs go up. And we'll talk about some resources for that later. Build more housing. So there's this debate, and you guys have heard it, I'm sure. I've used it in some cases. Again, get back to simple supply and demand. If you build more housing and you increase the supply so it's not a shortage, then prices should go down. And that's true. I mean, Econ 101 will tell you that. And you also have the other side of the argument, or it's not the other side, but it's, in conjunction with that, there's no reason not to create incentives to build housing that's within reach of baristas and EMTs and childcare workers and people like that. Because when those people have a stable place to live, everything works better. They rely less on the public safety net or public funding. And again, the community is stronger, the neighborhood is stronger, families are stronger, and there's a health component to it as well. So the other thing is to rethink our notion of housing. We have this idea that it's a single family, detached is the ideal for everybody. But up until, the sort of post-World War II period, we had residential hotels. We had this, enormous capacity of downtown urban housing that was very low cost. Some of it was pretty run down, it was pretty awful, but some of it was pretty nice. There was a real range of quality in those residential hotels, boarding houses, and things like that. I mean, they filled a niche in that ecosystem, right? And housing and finance policy at the federal level, post-war, adopted the position that we are no longer going to finance mixed-use development in downtown urban centers. And we're going to push it, and combined with the transportation kind of push to put highways everywhere, you demolished residential neighborhoods in the downtown core, and you pushed people out into the suburbs. And all of a sudden they needed a car to get where they were going to go. And they had a much larger square footage or footprint home. And you had a yard and a picket fence and all that kind of stuff. And that didn't really work for everybody in that economy, in society. So rethinking that and saying, okay, what do we do to reclaim some of that lost capacity? How are we going to fix that? And I think I see a lot of things that to me seem like analogs of that residential hotel kind of niche. You think tiny houses, micro apartments, things like that. So how do we fix it? One bite at a time, right? Does that guy look familiar? My neighbor's a cartoonist, so I hired him to avoid any copyright issues. But I like to use this when I do community reviews because, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. You guys are smart. Preservation. So what kind of resources? Let's kind of get into some resources here. You've got federal funding that can be brought to bear to preserve affordability for multi-level properties. Doesn't work for everything, but there's a real kind of a concerted effort with especially rural development properties that are coming off their affordability deed restriction. There's a real effort to use other federal funds to kind of pick those up and keep them affordable with and extend that deed restriction. So single family is a little more difficult to fund the preservation, but there are some programs available for that. And I tried really hard to spell out all these acronyms for you guys because I hope if I didn't make them all, let me know. I'm a founding member of STEAM, the Society to Eliminate Acronym Mania, and so I really try to make an effort to reduce those. Okay, so any questions on that? Okay, so you've got all these. I'm not going to go through all these, but these are. You can see the PowerPoint. I think we're going to make it available, right? Okay, great. So now we get to what I think is the most interesting stuff, and that is, again, trying to recapture that missing middle, or the diversity of housing types and price points that we had at one point in almost every urban center, and that they still have in a lot of places around the world. So we're sort of isolated in that sense. I mean, when I traveled to Switzerland and visited some friends in Zurich a couple of years ago, you know, they still have all that old infrastructure, all that historic, you know, the residential infrastructure all through their communities, and they just maintain it. They don't tear it down and build, you know, brand new apartment buildings. They just keep it going, and they put in Wi-Fi, or they put in new plumbing or electrical, and they have a mechanism at the government level that provides low interest loans for tenants that want to be owners. And so they create housing cooperatives, and they basically go in, they get a loan, and they make an offer, and they buy the home that they're the building they're in, and they become homeowners. So that's what our friends did in Zurich, and they've been there for 30 years, and it's a really wonderful concept, I think. We just don't have that infrastructure that they do. So, and this is one example. So does anybody know about guerrilla development in Portland? You do. So they have great names for their projects. This is called Jolene's First Cousin. That's the name of the project. What makes it cool, there are a couple of things that make it cool, is the financing, you know, idea. So they have, you know, some of the financing comes from a traditional bank loan. And then some of the financing, another layer of financing, is crowdsourced. It's equity crowdfunding from, you know, people that can afford to invest, say, $30,000 and up. Then you've got another level, final level, that's equity crowdfunding for folks who can afford $3,000 and up. So the project is going to be, I don't know, $1.5 million, so they need to raise, you know, X number per level, right? And so they're kind of branching out and saying, okay, we know we want to use private funding for this for a bunch of reasons, because you don't have to jump through so many hoops, you know, like you do with federal funds. And it creates some investment in terms of the local community. And I was just in Portland last week, and I didn't make it past this neighborhood, but it was really close to where we were staying. So here's the floor plan on this. That's the ground floor. So if you, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but on the left side is the living room and kitchen and kind of hangout space. And then there's retail in the front, okay? There's retail in the front on this one and in the back. And then when you look at the upstairs, they're very different. On the left, they've got 10 bedrooms. It's essentially an SRO. That SRO they have their own shared kitchen and dining facility downstairs where they can hang out. And there's an ADA bedroom in the downstairs, you know, unit. On the right side, there are two really nice market rate apartments. So they've got this is like missing middle housing, right? And you know, that's the kind of thing that I think is really interesting to consider. Like, how do we think outside the box, and then how do we finance it? So you guys know about equity crowdfunding? Anybody? Okay, so there's a law passed a few years ago called the Jobs Act that allowed this democratization of investment. So it meant that you can go in, and this is just an example, smallchange.org, or I think it's smallchange.org. You can go in there, they're a certified investment portal, and you can invest as little as $500, and you can pick a project and say, okay, I want to fund this bakery in downtown, you know, New Orleans, or I want to fund this cool like health food store in Washington, D.C., or I want to fund this small housing unit or housing complex somewhere else. And you have a rate of return over a period of time, just like any other investment. And there's risks like any other investment, but you kind of know, you get to pick what you invest in and target it pretty precisely. And so here's a couple of there's an open offer right now. This is a bed and breakfast run by artists in New Orleans. And so they're looking for, I don't know how much money they're trying to raise. I didn't click through on this one, but they've raised a little bit. It's been open for a little while. And here's one that's closed already. So it's this kind of residential project here. And they've got a bunch of them that are closed at different levels, up to $300,000 cases. But these are smaller developments, smaller amounts of money. these are not going to be as hard to sell to a neighborhood as a 150-unit complex, right? So there's, again, when you talk about costs, one of your costs is the time involved and the amount of work involved in getting a project approved. And if you've got a whole bunch of neighborhood pushback from a project, that costs you money. You know, it takes time away from your development. So, you know, I'm not going to do too much. You guys want to talk about ADUs at all? Accessory dwelling units? Oh, there's an acronym I forgot to spell out, sorry. Everybody know what those are? So just briefly, because I spent a long time today talking to people in the planning department of Boise City, you know, kind of get the lowdown on this. So Boise actually has some pretty flexible, you know, positions. Okay, thank you. When it comes to accessory dwelling units, the impact fees or the permit fees are not very expensive. It does increase your taxes because it's a separate residence and you're taxed on it. But in a lot of cases, ADUs they're also known as granny flats or, you know, that kind of thing. They represent a pretty low cost, low hanging fruit type way to expand your housing capacity in neighborhoods, as long as the neighborhoods are okay with it. So we'll, you know, talk more about that later. Social housing, I mentioned that in like Europe, that's kind of what they call affordable housing. Small footprint housing, I prefer this term to tiny houses, because tiny houses, again, conjure up an image of, you know, something that's like built to skirt the codes and, you know, zoning and stuff like that. And I think small footprint can be separate housing, standalone, or it can be shared wall housing. So, you know, lots of different, you know, expressions of that. The one on the right is in Harlem, actually. I visited Harlem on Yap's suggestion a couple of years ago. Beautiful city. Okay, so the Island Housing Trust, Martha's Vineyard, they have a land trust model. They have a diverse kind of mix of types of housing that they make available. There's housing for sale under a land lease model where you buy the house, they still own the property, but you have a 99-year lease on the property. The house on the bottom right is my brother-in-law Tom's house. He's considered part of the essential workforce on Chappaquiddick because he has a backhoe and he has a grader and he has all these other big heavy tools, right? And so he maintains the island, you know, the roads, and you know, he's on the fire department. And so they basically lease that acre of land in the middle of Chappaquiddick for $50 a month. And then he built his home on it, and he's got it as long as he's considered essential workforce. When he decides to sell it or leave the island, they have right of first refusal, and they can buy it from him at a price that is sort of indexed to a constant. So it's meant to avoid that kind of speculative investment inflation spiral. And then they have apartments as well. They do a lot of really cool housing there. You know, lots of different ways. I don't want to go through all of this. The one on the bottom, though, is the Kalkbreite co-op in Zurich. And that was a group of people that formed a co-op. They got, you know, cheap financing from the government. They took this piece of land that was an awkward, you know, shaped parcel with major arterials on either side and a subway line, you know, train line that ran underneath it, so it wasn't really desirable. And it's a 96-unit apartment with a theater and retail and commercial office space. And they have, throughout, they have, the units have adjoining doors, you know, on some of them. So if they have a large family, they can rent 2 units that adjoin and have like 5 or 6 or 7 people in them. They also have, which is essentially a short-term rental that's available to family members or friends that want to visit. And so it's a really cool complex. So I wanted to kind of end with, you know, I know there's a lot of, I mean, you guys have heard the term NIMBY, right? So there's always pushback when you try to build housing. I don't know of too many developers or communities where there isn't pushback. And so you know, I guess the thing I would encourage everyone to consider is, you know, if you have a set of priorities, think about them really clearly. Think about the sort of interconnectedness of like choices around open space, around density, around housing equity, around affordability, around land use and economic considerations, and then figure out what's my highest value, where do I have common ground with other people that have a lot of issues, and then work towards your common goals. If your common goal is creating equity and diversity and affordability in housing, go for it. If it's not, then you're not my friend. No, you'll still be my friend. And I think we're out of time, right? Okay. Otherwise, you'd see this really cool Swiss co-op thing.
Oh, do you want to watch it?
I don't know. I mean, it's up to you guys.
Yeah.
Or if you want
to. Keep it up at the end for discussion, but if everyone wants to see the video.
Well, show of hands. Who wants to see the video? Okay. All right. I think that's We'll now watch it and not work. Oh, hey, it's doing something. Sweet. Okay, I'm getting used to the technology here. There we go. So this will kind of blow your mind. It's got subtitles. I hope that's okay for you guys.
Adrian Glauser and his family have been living in an apartment building in the Rosfeld area in Bern for several years. When the former landlord wanted to sell the place, the tenants worried about losing their home. So they pooled together, bought the place, and turned it into a cooperative.
Der Vorteil des genossenschaftlichen Wohnens für mich besteht.
The advantage of living in a cooperative is that I don't just have nice neighbors by accident. On the contrary, there are people here who have a real interest in living together and who are willing to invest. It's not just people who live here but then go somewhere else to socialize.
Sind und sich da einzugeben und nicht einfach nur da wohnen und mit dem Auto irgendwo hinfahren, um ihre sozialen Kontakte dort zu pflegen.
While the families in Rosfeld formed their cooperative out of necessity, this one started with a group of friends that wanted to live together and bought a place in Bern's Lorena area, a neighborhood close to the town center. It used to be a workers' area. Now it's known for its many small cooperatives and alternative ways of living.
There's a lot of hype about this area. Everybody talks about the Lorraine. It's a so-called alternative neighborhood. It's really renowned. I know so many people who would like to live here.
Inzwischen Renommee. Ich kenne sehr viele Leute, die gerne hier wohnen würden. Es zeichnet die Lorraine aus.
What's special about the Lorraine is that the people living here are really connected and do a lot together. They work on projects or engage in political activities. It would be a shame to lose these qualities because of a change in the population of this area.
Im Rahmen eines Wechsels der Bevölkerung diese Qualitäten verloren gingen.
This plot of land currently hosts an urban vegetable garden. The city's plans to build a 13-apartment building here caused quite some protest among the neighbors, who thought the rents would be too high for this place. And the protesters even presented a counter-proposal.
Das hier, das ist sozusagen eine Antwort aus dem Quartier. Das sind
several people have worked on this. That doesn't cost more than 25,000 euros. It's heat insulated and energy self-sufficient, and they can be stacked on top of each other. This construction is made to support 5 levels.
Isoliert, es soll energieautark sein und es ist vor allem auch stapelbar. Also diese Struktur ist so berechnet, dass man 5 Stockwerke hoch übereinander bauen könnte. Das ist der sogenannte Quartierhof.
The Quartierhof is a building of national importance. For many years, it was inhabited by all kinds of people looking for a cheap living solution. Alternative people, political people, hippies and freaks.
Günstige Wohnungen suchten allerhand, alternative politische Leute, Hippies, Freaks. Dann hat man
After a complicated negotiation process, the city agreed to buy it and pass it on to the cooperative formed by the inhabitants.
Und der Genossenschaft, die Bewohnerinnen gegründet hatten, das im Baurecht abzugeben. Es ist ein bescheidener Wohnkomfort.
The apartments are small and provide very modest living standards, but the rents are very cheap, and it offers housing for very different kinds of people.
Und da können also sehr unterschiedliche Menschen wohnen. Also das ist jetzt das Haus.
This building caused quite a stir. The owner, a former city parliamentarian, intends to sell the 2 upper levels for 1.8 million francs.
1,8 Millionen Grössenordnung wünscht.
I don't think he'll get that much for it, but you never know. The problem is that the Lorraine area has become so popular that there will always be people with the cash to pay for it.
Die Lorraine inzwischen so attraktiv ist, dass es immer Leute gibt, die private Mittel haben, um sich so etwas leisten zu können.
So the community garden that he was showing folks in that little prototype, they weren't objecting to the density, they were objecting to the cost per unit. So what they were trying to do is keep the costs affordable for folks to live, for average people to live in the Lorraine. So I thought it was interesting.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes still for questions and discussion. So I invite anyone who has comments or questions to ask Erik or Shellan, and we can stay and chat for a little while. I do want to remind everyone that I have a assignment sheet on a clipboard that's floating around. If you don't mind filling that out, that lets me know, kind of who is here, and if you want to sign up for our newsletter from Idaho Smart Growth, you can list your email address there as well. But we'll go ahead and open it up.
I'm wondering about that development in Portland, where it was sort of almost like a dorm style, and I was just wondering who lives there. Is it student housing mostly? Is it, how much are the rents?
Okay,
what
so
do you know?
those units rent for $450 a month in downtown Portland. $450. If you've looked at prices in Portland, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And so it might be students, it might be creative professionals that have their own business, or people that work in the kind of retail service industry, anybody, retirees.
And then they share the downstairs living space.
Right.
So about 11 people.
Yeah, 11 total. And I think I mentioned that the downstairs unit is 88.
Right.
Accessible. Oh, go ahead.
Yes, I wonder, when we talk about housing, we usually talk about housing and renting and stuff, but there's always a connection. And also, when we talk about housing, we often talk also about government and housing. But why don't we talk so often about economics and housing and government? This is a three that's more involved than just government. How do we react as a government to it, and how can individual citizen react to it? Because I think the economics worldwide is going in a very destructive development, and yeah, I think economics should be always also looked into when we talk about housing.
Thank you. I agree 100%. And that's kind of part of my
Can you repeat
my
the
work.
question?
So she's just commenting, observing that most of the time when we talk about housing, we're talking about housing and government, that kind of relationship between housing and government, but there's also a strong connection between, the housing market and the overall economy. Is that?
Yeah.
And so how else would you define?
I just think it used to be that one generation ago, two generations ago, one person could earn the money in the family and you could afford the house. Then came the generation where mom and dad, two people had to work to afford. Now people feel lucky if they're a teacher that they have a tiny house. Sometimes you find that. You find that. Next generation, will it be that two teacher families feel lucky when they have a tiny house? It's the development that we see.
It's not sustainable.
Exactly.
And a short story clarifies that. I had a hotline call a couple weeks ago from a single mom who was doing piecework as a house painter for it rhymes with Maury Parton Homes in the Treasure Valley. So a housing developer, right? And she was making $10 an hour as a house painter, doing piecework. So she wasn't working full time. She didn't have benefits. She was calling the hotline to find some housing subsidy, right? Some public subsidized housing. So what the employer is asking the public to do is subsidize that wage.
Exactly.
Because it's not a living wage. And what it made me realize is that back in the 80s, I worked as a house painter in Salt Lake. My first wife at the time was a cafe lady at the health food store. We bought a house in a nice neighborhood in Salt Lake for $77,000 that just recently sold for $750,000. So she's now making about the same amount I did on an hourly basis. And the housing is way out of reach. So you're absolutely right. Yes?
Maybe a question for either. Are units like that Portland example legal per Boise's code in any area to have units that small and those kind of formulations? I just don't know the code that well.
Units, which units?
Like the Portland one with the shared office. Is that legal?
Joleen's first cousin, yeah. You know, it's a dormitory. It's essentially a dormitory style housing. So it's not a whole lot different from a student dormitory. Do you guys have any ideas?
Well, I mean, we haven't looked at that, but essentially that piece of it is a 10-bedroom dwelling, or 11-bedroom
So
dwelling.
in that case, it would probably not be illegal because I think in Boise you can't have more than 5 unrelated persons occupying a residence. So unless it has some kind of other characterization or definition, then maybe the answer is no. I think I've talked to Hal Simmons about this in the past, and that was one of the issues. And that density, housing density varies quite a bit between Boise, Meridian, Nampa. So there's a big range of unrelated persons that can live in a house.
I think that an important point is that there are regulatory barriers to creating different and unique housing types. And I think there would be some concerns, I don't know the building code well enough, but there would be some concerns with square footage of kitchen and bathroom space based on your bedroom. So there are international building code standards that hinder the ability to create unique housing types. They can certainly be overcome, as we've seen in many of the examples, right? But it takes time and money.
And to that point, the International Residential Code.
That one probably doesn't have any part now.
Yeah. Just a couple of years ago, Macy Miller, anybody know Macy? She's a tiny house architect. But she went back to Kansas with some other folks, and they advocated for a change in the International Residential Code, which kind of oversees how much square footage you need and things like that. And they were able to get the Code Council to relax the requirements for staircase design and for egress windows in tiny houses. Okay, I'll use the term here because that's what they were referring to. So it meant that you could have a steeper pitch on your staircase, and you didn't necessarily have to have an egress window because the houses are so small. I mean, the idea of an egress window is if somebody, they need to find them in a bedroom and get them out, right? But if the house is like, it's a one room, it's this one big room, then they can get in and out. And so they said yes. She and I went to the Idaho Division of Building Safety after that and kind of advocated for that change to be translated in Idaho, and they agreed. So there are some relaxed standards there. It's not going to affect all houses, but I think you need to have your minimum square footage on a room is what, 70 feet? I think it's 70 square feet. So that's not much. I mean, that's 7 by 10, or something like that.
Yeah, the idea of housing being speculative rather than shelter, I feel like is at the root of much of the problem, not all of it. Are there mechanisms for limiting how many homes in an area are owned on a speculative basis versus for shelter? Can that be done? Are there countries or cities that?
Switzerland, yes. Idaho, no.
Okay.
How's that?
Yeah, there's places in the United States that do, I guess I don't think it would be called speculative, but it's owner-occupied zoning, stuff like that. There's zoning that relates to owner occupancies. It is not, it's in a place like Idaho, and in many places in the United States, it's not particularly likely.
one of your slides said that Switzerland was banning second homes.
No, we're not banning them, just limiting the percentage. They said, you know, no more than 20% of the housing market, you know, or the housing stock in any one, you know, unit of the geography or whatever. A canton, which is a county, I guess, or a city, can be a cold bed, which is either a vacation home or a short-term rental. And Berlin banned whole house short-term rentals a few years ago outright. They grandfathered some in that were already there. But if you get caught trying to use a whole flat or whole house rental as an Airbnb without a permit, it's a €100,000 fine. They're pretty serious about it. And the reason is they didn't want to become like other cities in Europe where people had to leave. They had to leave their cities because they couldn't live in them, like Cascade or Calm, places like that where, you know, I mean, I interviewed business owners in the Cascade area that had to turn down, you know, they couldn't get their first pick employees, whether it's a, you know, radiologist or a cook or whatever, because there's no place for them to live. Mm-hmm. So, I'll let you take the next one.
The place in Portland, is that like a market-driven solution, or was that like some people who I heard crowdsourcing was part of it? You know what I'm saying? Like, is that scalable? Like, realistically, could some investor decide to start making housing like that, and it being a smart investment?
It depends a lot on the regulatory barriers to creating that design. That design, I suspect, is, and I don't know this project super well, but I mean, my gut is saying that design requires a very well thought out location.
Yeah.
Right? It requires a location that has a lot of access to services. And it requires a market that is willing, you know, that has, you know, what, 11 people. That's not huge. That's not a barrier. So I think, yeah, it's probably replicable, but it's certainly not, it's, you know, there's no silver bullet, but I think that there are many investment groups that focus on micro units. It's a little bit different than that example, but, you know, micro units which don't exist here really, at least in the way that they do other places. There are investment groups that entirely focus on those types of alternative housing.
I just lived in like Chicago and Portland and seen my neighborhoods converted, you know, overnight into condo, you know, from apartments into condos and stuff like that. And it'd be nice if that could be steered in a more productive direction.
I noticed a lot of new construction in the neighborhoods we were in Portland last week, like that missing middle development. So missing middle would be anything from like what duplex, triplex up to 19 units, I think is typical. And in terms of the financing, there are a lot of people really interested in the whole impact investment, equity crowdfunding piece. We're going to be talking about that again. I had a panel on impact investing at the Association of Cities in June, and one of the guests on the panel was Matthew Weatherly-White from Caprock Investment. Caprock has about $4 billion in client assets under management. And somebody in the audience said, well, what are your clients wanting to invest in? You know, what are the top 3 things that they want to invest in? He said, that's easy. Renewable energy and affordable housing, which kind of blew me away. So it means I need to go have lunch with him and find out more about that. But the other thing to think about is, imagine this, okay? Just think big here. So I was on the phone with somebody from ICCU today, out of Central Credit Union. I said, what if you guys created a CD that's the Stronger Idaho Fund, or Stronger Idaho CD, and the idea is it works just like your other CDs. It works just like your other money that you've got on deposit that you loan out. But the idea is you market it as a local investment opportunity where all the money from that CD stays within Idaho's borders. And it can fund missing middle housing, it can fund business startups and expansion, education, things like that. People local, that's the idea. And it would help compensate for the lack of an affordable housing trust fund at the state level.
Thank you.
That's my silent applause. I support that pitch.
Any more questions for our guests today? Okay. Well, thank you again, Shellan and Erik. It was awesome to learn from you.